Very good. Good afternoon. Very good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keith Bottomley, the Deputy Policy Chairman here at the City of London Corporation, the Deputy Political Leader. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here physically and online to this very important event. It's great to have you here at Guildhall, those that are here in person. Tonight we are all here in the old library, as we call it. It was a library actually originally, to celebrate the Transition Plan Taskforce's milestone event, Unlocking Finance and Growth Through Credible Transition Plans. When this old library was built a little over 150 years ago, Queen Victoria sat on the throne, and of course the world was very different in 1872. It was an era of rapid development, from the building of the London Underground to medical breakthroughs to technological change. And it's no exaggeration to say that we live in a world that the Victorians built. But building today's world, as we all know now, came at a cost. In the words of the former US President Barack Obama, we are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. And that is why we are meeting today, so that tomorrow's world can, yes, continue to expand our horizons in that Victorian spirit of expansion and innovation and progression, but very importantly to do so in a way that protects rather than harms our precious planet. And at the frontier of these efforts to preserve our climate is indeed the Transition Plan Taskforce. May I congratulate them on their work to date. Incredibly important work. It's an exemplary demonstration of how we in the United Kingdom can provide leadership in accelerating the transition to net zero. Today, we are harvesting the fruits of that task force's labour with the publication of 15 papers to help inform the transition. This work covers nearly 40 sectors and includes areas of particular importance to the city: asset management and banking. Transition plans bring rigour and credibility to private sector leadership, helping ensure that net zero pledges made over the last few years do turn into real action. And we do need action. At the City Corporation, we have a bold climate action strategy published in October of 2020 that commits us to achieving net zero carbon emissions in our own operations by 2027. And we are on track to deliver exactly that outcome. We also aim to become net zero across our investment and supply chain by 2040, and to support the achievement of net zero for the whole square mile by the same year. This includes aligning our investments to the Paris Agreement goals and ensuring that tackling climate change is at the heart of all of the decisions that we make. And as the voice for the UK financial and professional services and insurance sector, we are working to ensure that London is the leading global centre for green finance, a key part of the solution in tackling climate change. A crucial part of this ambition and of transition plans writ large is transition finance. The Transition Finance Market Review is at the heart of our collective leadership efforts. The review will consider how good quality transition plan disclosures can support the scaling of transition finance as a market in a way which maximises decarbonisation efforts. And with a strong emphasis on credibility and integrity, the review team will work closely with the Transition Plan Taskforce. The City Corporation is delighted to be hosting the Secretariat for this review. For us, this transition work is a core pillar of our wider sustainability efforts, which also include carbon markets, nature, impact finance, and regulation. We know the stakes are high. The climate crisis is real and unrelenting. The march of time is unstoppable. We cannot, of course, roll the clock back to 1872, but we can roll back the worst impacts of climate devastation. Working together, we can ensure that we have credible transition plans that leave no company behind. Working together, we can unlock economic growth in a sustainable manner, one that puts the environment at the heart of finance and finance at the heart of the environment. I now have great pleasure of introducing our next speaker, someone who has made a huge contribution to sustainable finance and indeed to transition work, the co-head of the Transition Plan Taskforce Secretariat, the founding director and principal investigator of the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, and the inaugural Lombard Odier Associate Professor and Senior Research Fellow of Sustainable Finance at the University of Oxford. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Ben Caldicott.
Thank you, Keith, for that very fulsome and kind introduction. Big thanks also to the corporation for hosting the Transition Plan Taskforce again at the Guildhall. We were last here at the Guildhall in February last year, and it's great to see lots of familiar faces as well as many new ones. This month also marks 2 years since the taskforce was formally launched. At that time, there was no best practice framework for the creation of credible, robust, and comparable transition plans. And the TPT was set up to create this. In October last year, we published our final disclosure framework after the result of extensive consultation. And our work, not just the disclosure framework, but also the guidance and the other materials you're going to be hearing about today, has been the result of a practitioner-led, multi-stakeholder process that's involved hundreds of organizations around the world, not just organizations in the UK. Our disclosure framework and supporting guidance and materials are designed for global adoption and designed to be consistent with existing global frameworks, particularly the ISSB and GFANZ. Our framework is based on 3 pillars: ambition, action, accountability. If transition plans are sufficiently ambitious and delivered with appropriate actions and with proper accountability, they can help society allocate capital to companies and assets that are actually contributing to the aims of the Paris Agreement and away from those that aren't. As part of the TPT, we also introduce an important concept, this idea of a strategic and rounded approach. And this is the idea that it's not just about an entity's decarbonisation pathway or its ability to manage its own climate-related risks and opportunities, but also its wider contribution to societal decarbonisation and to wider societal climate resilience. And that's a big conceptual leap that takes us beyond climate-related financial risk disclosure and creates a tool with many possible use cases and different users. And some of those go well beyond capital markets. So many companies in the UK and internationally are now starting to use the TPT to create their own transition plans. You'll be hearing from some of them today. Here in the UK government and the FCA have committed to consulting on mandatory transition plan disclosures as they move to endorse the ISSB. And many other jurisdictions are also considering transition plan requirements. And throughout our work, and now there has been significant interest from those different jurisdictions in the work of the task force. So the benefits of high-quality transition plans for financial institutions, for companies, for regulators, for policymakers is becoming increasingly clear around the world. It's also clear, and Keith emphasized this point too, that without credible transition plans, we won't be able to realize effective transition finance. And that's one of the reasons why the mandate of the task force was extended earlier this year so we could support the work of Vanessa's review, the Transition Finance Market Review, and you'll hear from Vanessa shortly. Now, today, in terms of what we are publishing, we're publishing our final set of technical materials. Following consultation at the end of last year, we're also publishing our final sector guidance. This includes a sector summary, which covers 30 sectors of the global economy, as well as 7 sector deep dives for asset owners, asset managers, banks, electric utilities and power generators, food and beverage sector, metals and mining, and lastly, oil and gas. And lots of you in the room have contributed to the creation of that guidance, so thank you for all of those contributions. We're also publishing the final versions of our implementation guidance, explore the disclosure recommendations, and the transition planning cycle. And critically, both of those things, as well as actually a lot of the work since we published drafts for consultation, now have a greater focus on adaptation and resilience. So that's coming throughout the things that we're publishing today. During the drafting of the disclosure framework and sector guidance, we asked working groups on adaptation, nature, and the just transition to advise us on the integration of those topics into transition plans and transition planning. We then asked these groups and another group on SMEs to produce advisory papers on each topic, exploring how transition planning can extend beyond realizing net zero. And each group has published their findings today, and each of these publications, I think, really lays a marker for further work in each of these really important areas, not just in terms of how we can deepen work on transition plans in each area, but also how these can all integrate with one another. Finally, today the TPT is publishing a paper on the opportunities and challenges of transition plans in EMDEs. This is the product of engagement with officials and businesses in a number of emerging markets. It contributes to thinking in multilateral fora on international approaches to transition plans, and we've been very active in those. It also sits alongside previously published guidance, which maps TPT to ISSB and ESRS and TCFD, lots of acronyms. These documents show specifically how the TPT builds on the ISSB, and also how the TPT can help firms with their CSRD reporting as well. And these products, again, are the result of an incredible amount of work from many people around the world, but many people in this room, so thank you again for all of those contributions. Now, enough from me. I'm going to now hand over to Amelia, who is the climate editor of the FT, who's going to moderate not one panel, but 2 panels. And the first one's going to be on how transition plans can unlock capital and support growth. So, Amelia, over to you, and maybe the panelists can come up. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and as my panelists get in place, it's great to see such a fantastic crowd of people who are so interested and invested in this, and also in this august place, which has, one of my colleagues pointed out, a lot of embedded carbon, very sustainable in here. So today's an important day for lots of reasons. We had the latest climate change news from the Copernicus service of the EU. The oceans are 21 degrees in March, 21.7, which is unprecedented, but I won't dwell too much on that. More so, I want to point out the European Court of Human Rights ruling today in favour of a group of more than 2,000 Swiss women, mainly in their 70s, just to show it's a cross-generational issue, that a finding that it's the government responsibility to cut emissions in line with their climate targets without infringing on human rights. So I think, as we have litigation and regulation, there will be more momentum for the transition planning. To date, it's been very patchy, I'm sure everybody would agree. So I'm going to start with you, Helen, as the CEO of Nest, because we're talking about transition plans and transition finance. Nest has 38 billion roughly in assets under its direction.
Yep.
It's also been ahead of the curve in what we politely call nudging companies to have good transition plans. And you've been engaging with Barclays, another bank, not the one on the stage, over its climate policies. So with all of that in mind, what does a credible plan look like from your perspective?
Well, I think the guidance in the TPT framework really is very clear about that, and we're very supportive of it. But I think a really credible plan has to have at least 3 elements to it. First of all, a very clear commitment to net zero, but that's not enough. It's also really important to have shorter term milestones so that the plan is not just long-term and enables set and forget.
So net zero by 2050, which quite a lot of companies have, that's not
enough, yeah. You have to have shorter term milestones. I think the second thing is a credible plan has to have actions in it. It has to demonstrate what activities are going to be undertaken to make this plan happen. Those activities need to be financed. You need to be able to see how that plan's going to be delivered. And the third thing is, it's really important that the plan is very clear about dependencies, where those dependencies are, where the plan is contingent on other things happening, and on impacts. And the impact on key stakeholders, really important. Key stakeholders like customers, key stakeholders like investors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so timelines and potholes so far. Jonas, can I turn to you? Lloyd's is not a major fossil fuel lender, as I read it, but you do have climate risk associated with farming and food and buildings. How do you grapple with that in assessing your transition plan, and have you been able to use the TPT guidance to shape that?
Yes, we have. I mean, as an institution, we've been fortunate. We've been able to look at the transition for some time, so happy to give you a
tell us a little bit about your plan.
How we go about it, why did it impact us, and I can give you a little bit of observations from our early adoption of credible transition plans, the kind of work stream that we are running at the moment. So we started a couple of years ago, starting to think about transition as it is. And I would say one of the first things we agreed on very early, it is that we have to have an absolute, complete, authentic approach to it, which effectively means we have to walk the talk. And that's really important. And by doing that, we can also have authentic relationship conversations with our clients.
So when you say authentic, who decides it's authentic?
Well, I think the only thing is it's about being transparent. I think sustainability is about being very transparent. We have to share your experiences. I think that's really important. So although we think about financial institutions, we talk about emissions. Our emissions is, yes, it's relevant that we have our own operating emissions. The round number is like 0.1 megatons for us as from our own operations, so not very material from that point of view. But we still have a journey to make. We have to learn how we are going to transition our properties, our offices, etc. And by doing that, we can share that with our clients. And we might identify that we are sharing the same sort of challenges as well. Likewise, with our supply chain, we are now 2 years into what we call the Emerald program that we have got. This is the program where we're engaging with our largest suppliers. Probably quite a few of them are here today. And just to understand how they are transitioning, make sure there is an understanding what the expectations are, and how we can help them. Because very often, suppliers may not have the bandwidth to make the changes that we will be able to do.
How do you give them a timeline, speaking of timelines, on when they can come to the party?
Yes, it is. And I don't try to create a situation where we are saying, you have to do this by this time, otherwise you are out. We're not trying to find reasons not to work with suppliers. We're just trying to share information, give a target of what we're trying to achieve. So that's sort of how we're doing it. And our emissions from our supply chain is like 8 times more than our own operations, so much more material. So by really leaning into these relationships, we can make a big difference. but of course, the elephant in the room, that's, we have our own operations, supply chains, but scope 3, our financed emissions, is the big exposure for us, which is about 200 times bigger than our own operations. So just put that in context of why that is important.
I think for everyone, it's something like 90% of footprint is supply chain.
It absolutely is. So how do we kind of set ourselves up for that? Obviously, as a founder's signature to the NZBA, we very quickly realized we have to start to develop and create our net zero sector strategies for the high emitting industries. So we've done that. We publicized that in a sustainability report, which you can all read about. But at the same time, in parallel, we did realize that we also have to do something about the engagement with our clients. So the credible transition plans is something that we started to lean into very, very, very early. And we've been obviously part of the TPT, who's done a fantastic job. And we are using the TPT and others to develop our credible transition plan and how we engage with the clients.
And so is a credible plan something that's been given a tick by the Science Based Targets Initiative, the cooperative group, or what in inverted commas is credible?
Yes, so it is credible. I'm looking at the TPT, we look at the Climate Action 100, TPI, etc. So we bring all that into it. But again, of course, it is the ambition, action, and accountability that matters. If you don't have that, it just is not going to work. But at the same time, you have, what is also really important is you don't see this as just as an assessment process. It's like a compliance sort of exercise, because that's not what it is. It is an opportunity to really lean into it, listen to your clients, understand how you can support them. Frankly, I think I'm not going to say it came as a surprise, but of course that is, if you have that conversation, it works. They will tell you, I get it, but I need you to help me. So if you want me to be credible, you need to be credible by helping me.
So what sort of help does that mean? Is it information sharing is what you're saying
about
about
sharing? They may say, well, in order to do that, that will cost me X, Y, Z. I have to, there will be trade-offs, naturally. So you have to understand what that means.
So you negotiate about those trade-offs, who's paying for it?
Exactly. So you have to, how long will that take? What time do we give? When do we set our targets? What do we have to achieve by that? Are you a large company, a small company? Are you behind the curve? How can we get you up on the curve? How can we share the information and support you? It is transition. It's called transition for a reason, right? But of course, there needs to be an escalation process. If those clients and companies that are not prepared to make those sort of investments or engagement, you have to be thoughtful about how if you look down the line, it's not only from a sort of client relationship, it's also a risk point of view, because if you're not prepared to adjust to what is coming, you're increasing the risk of your own company as well.
Okay, I'll come back to the cost question because I think that's important. Alistair, you've been working for Rachel Reeves and Ed Miliband, who were some of the most Ed was one of the most popular politicians in Dubai at the UN Climate Summit. Everybody wanted to talk to him. In my time in business journalism, decades I won't go into, I've never heard so many business people calling for government intervention or government action or regulation, which is still a conundrum to me. So what's your advice to businesses who, frankly are disillusioned with government policies everywhere? It doesn't matter which country you go to or which company you speak to. And, there's been a shifting Labour manifesto, so that's contributed to that. What do you say to those who are trying to come up with a credible plan, which, to me means, balancing the climate risk and growth that is needed?
So I think, just to briefly explain who I am, because I'm probably likely to be the least familiar to all of you on the panel. My name's Alistair. I've been an MP since last October, and since December I've had the privilege of being part of both Ed Miliband and Rachel Reeves' shadow teams in Parliament as PPS. If you don't know what that means, I didn't either when I got offered the job, but it's essentially helping to facilitate the work of the team with the wider Parliamentary Labour Party, but then also supporting as an outreach arm of the team's work. What that goes to say is, I'm relatively new to this, and while I've done a great deal of work previous in the Bank of England in this space, it's something I think we're very keen to signal our enthusiasm for, which is why I'm here today. But I should probably flag up front that if I seem to announce any new policy here today, it's entirely by mistake, and very, very likely to be the result of me misspeaking, rather than being on part of any inside track.
Consummate politician.
The question, I think, really, I think the question sets up, I think, one of the fundamental reasons for me being here today, and the fundamental message I want to get across to everyone in the audience here. At the election, we're going to have a whole host of big political choices we face as a country, but I think one of the areas where we realise that as a government in waiting, we need to be ready to step up is to provide the boldness and stability of leadership, of policy direction, and of work and engagement in this space that's been lacking for quite some time now. That's not to make a particularly party political point out of it, but I think it's just a simple matter of fact that in every bit of industry engagement we've done, whether it's been some of our Infrastructure Commission work, our Financial Services Review, or the wider outreach that the team does, the number one message that comes through time and time again is the frustration of stakeholders right across the economy who would like to get moving on a lot of this stuff, who would like to really lean into this agenda, who get why it's important, not just for our climate, but also for our economic opportunity as a nation, but who feel that at the moment, they don't have the clarity of direction from policymakers to be able to push things along, to be able to secure the investment they need to get going, nor do they really feel like the government is committed to breaking through some of those big, tough questions around things like planning, around things like how we best enable finance to flow where it needs to really get to where we want to as a country on this. Now, a big part of enabling that, as we've heard from panellists here today, is transition planning. I know from my work previous to the Bank of England how important this is, not just to ensure that we've got a credible vision for decarbonising sectors right across the economy, but to making sure that our fantastic financial institutions here can play their part in supporting that work. And so, hopefully, today, if not able to give you a great deal of policy insight in terms of news, I can reassure you all that we get it. We're coming into this with a lot of ambition, with a real vision for how we want to transform the economy and particularly drive green growth over those first 5 years, whether it's breaking down planning barriers around grid reform to really turbocharge our journey to net zero and particularly clean power by 2030, or whether it's working with sectors right across the economy to make sure that we've got clear, consistent, ambitious and stable policy visions for each part of our industrial strategy that makes sure holistically, we're not just driving growth, but we're driving growth right across the country in a way that's contingent and compatible.
I'm going to interrupt you there, Alistair.
I think we're hopefully go for it.
So, ambition, that's good. That's good, but not concrete. And I imagine that as you work your way around even small businesses around your constituency, that they have lots of concrete issues, and they are to do with issues like permitting, or whether it's something to go on their rooftop, or whether it's something, an offshore wind farm. Yep. The Bank of England you've invoked there, it's been quite clear. Most central banks have been quite clear. They don't think it's the role of the central banks to set policy in this area. So, back in the policy space, without breaking too much news here, give us a concrete example of what would be a solution for companies trying to set out a transition plan.
So I think there's a few things we've said we want to do.
A real-world example.
A real-world example.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the clearest policy we've brought forward so far is probably specifically focused on the energy sector, and some of the real focus work we'd like to do to break through some of the grid reform issues we know we're going to need to tackle head on very early in a Labour government if we're going to be able to deliver that transition to clean energy by 2030, which is an incredibly ambitious but important target. So that's things about cutting down planning times from years to months. It's making sure that we've got a future systems operator that's empowered to do much more active mapping of the system, and it's breaking through some of the grid queue that we've got at the moment to pull out projects that we know aren't moving forward quick enough so that we can finally start to get some of these projects online really quickly. Now that's one very specific area, but right across that we're going to have to make a lot of good, quick decisions, working in partnership with industry, if we're going to be able to turbocharge that transition journey. A big part of that, I think, is going to be data too. We recognise that in lots of areas, actually, data is a real barrier to enable that and a real barrier to financial flows at the moment. And so working quite early on with industry and with a number of sectors across the economy to make sure that we've got a better I guess, more granular and consistent and reliable framework for data availability would be really important too. But I think by leaning into clear targets, by setting clear policy direction, by pulling away risk to business and risk to investment, be that planning, be that policy uncertainty, or be that skills gaps, we think there's a whole host of areas where we can hopefully push things forward.
Cool, great, thank you very much. Vanessa, last but not least, How does, well, you've been steeped in TPT since the beginning. How does it address these issues of different jurisdictions, which Ben referred to earlier in his opening? You know, he had a whole lot of acronyms about different rules, ISSB, IFRS, you know, we could go IASB, we could keep going for the rest of the night. From Brussels to California, everybody is setting quite different targets. There's, you know, perhaps an incoming Labor government will have a whole suite of other suggestions when they come in. How does TPT address those issues?
Well, if you look at the framework, actually it is based in GFANS and ISSB, and ISSB is becoming, I think we can see, one of the core standards.
So ISSB being an accounting standard and GFANS being a sort of financial services lobby group, pressure group.
That's a bit harsh. They put out a very good piece of work in relation to transition planning in the finance sector. It's probably where we might go.
Okay.
And TPT has looked at and mapped how the framework aligns with the core framework, other frameworks that you might use. So effectively, you can work through what a TPT disclosure plan will satisfy in terms of the EU requirements and what extra you need to do. Now, I accept that across the different core jurisdictions, you've got a bunch of complicated requirements that don't necessarily all speak to each other. I think the TPT is great in that it's done that really dull work for you to help you navigate what you need to do. So if you're going to ground yourself in TPT, what are the builds that you need to add for the EU, for example, or for another jurisdiction?
So give me an example of, or perhaps Lloyd's could help you out with this, but give me an example of how that mapping would work.
So if you look at the TPT is a disclosure framework, so it's not normative in terms of exactly what your short, medium, and longer term targets are. If you look at the EU regime, the CSRD disclosure requirements in relation to, sorry, this is really nerdy.
She's a lawyer at heart, you know.
I'm not just at heart. The CSRD has very particular disclosure requirements that require you to break out emissions targets probably in much more detail because it is being more directional than I think sits within TPT's mandate. So you can see that between the two, there will be additional disclosure that you have to make to deal with the data that the EU is looking for.
And we've touched on scope 3 being the big elephant in the room, of course, 90% of most emissions, lots of double counting, potentially a very thorny area. And we had today stats from MSCI showing that while something like 60% of the MSCI index has scope 1 and scope 2 targets from operational emissions, only 11% have scope 3, and that suggests to me that people don't have a clue about how to map their scope 3. Does TPT help with that, with the guidance?
TPT sets an expectation. The technical guidance sets more sector-specific suggestions as to how metrics should be provided. I think you then go back and you look through using other methodologies like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as to how you're then going to calculate.
Okay.
Or PCAF, or, you know.
Right. Will it make a reference to that?
I'm pretty sure it does in the footnotes, of which there are many.
Okay. Always read the footnotes, first rule of financial journalism. Jonas, can I ask you how, and Helen actually, what happens when a business has a perfectly good transition plan, seems like it's, you know, all kosher, and but it's got growth, and it's making acquisitions, it's selling things, it's spotting other opportunities. Some parts of the business might grow faster than other parts in unexpected ways. How as financiers and investors do you map that, and how do you have a checkpoint at which companies can come to you and say, sorry, messed all that up, whether it's your loan portfolio or your investment portfolio, and actually it's going to look like we have more emissions in the next 6 months before they come down, or vice versa?
Happy to start. I mean, it's like with everything else. Everything is moving, nothing is set. We review annually when you look at credible transition plans, etc. There might be triggers, there might be acquisitions, things might change. But again, we shouldn't let, perfect, be the enemy of good either, okay? Data will not be perfect from the day one. Processes will not be perfect from day one. We simply have to understand and, appreciate that we have to be agile. We have to update as data get better. We update, we improve. Let's make sure we don't sit on the fence and just thinking that everything one day is going to be perfect. Yeah. I don't think anyone is expecting that. So, we have an economy out here that needs to fire. We need to support it. We should not be holding back. We should be supporting it and inform ourselves as best we can and make this. But of course, transitions should be part of decision making. In an investment process, it should not be two different processes. They should come together from a strategy point.
Is there a first mover disadvantage, though, in that if you have been ambitious or seemingly ambitious in your planning, and you get to a particular point, you think, oh, actually, it looks like our finance emissions are off. We've messed up. How do you come clean about that in a way that is not damaging?
Yeah, I mean, I used the word early on. You have to be transparent. Explain what it is. Things are going to be wrong. We just have to share why was that. We make it a wrong assessment. It's not in the spirit. The spirit is to do the best they can, or we can, all of us, and we share that. That's the first learning. If we can share that, we share it with others, we better understand it, we take that into account.
And Helen, I mean, with investment, there's been quite a lot of debate about what I call stick or twist, divest or engage. Nest has largely engaged. Is there a point at which companies don't show enough progress, don't really engage, seem to engage, but actually have no evidence for it, and you say, okay, that's a red line for us?
Yes, there is, but it's a last resort. And we feel really strongly that we should stay invested and we should stay engaged as long as we absolutely can. It's a really easy way to hit your targets and to perhaps make yourself feel better and perhaps save yourself a lot of grief to divest. You do not solve the problem if you do that. All you do is pass the problem on to somebody else. Somebody else picks that investment up. Perhaps somebody who is less enlightened, who cares less, who's not going to be as engaged. You might make yourself feel better, but you haven't solved the global problem one iota. So we would only disinvest if we really do think that it is a sector where there is just no way that it's going to be able to transition, or where the companies just systematically over and over again will not engage with us. And we have done that, but it is very much a last resort. But I think your question just illustrates, your earlier question illustrates how important transition plans really are. So, if you think historically, what we've done is we've used emissions data to help us understand what to do. So we're a huge investor. We have 13 million members. We're investing about 500 to 600 million pounds every month. We need to invest that money sustainably, not because we're great people, but because investing that money sustainably is good for our members in terms of their financial wealth, and because, frankly, they expect it of us. They tell us that they expect us to invest responsibly.
Is that increasing, that feedback to you that they expect you to invest sustainably?
Yes. 3/4 of our members, when we survey them, tell us, not you have our permission to invest sustainably. They tell us they expect us to do that. Now, the average Nest member earns just over £20,000 a year. We're not talking about wealthy people, but those people understand and are enlightened and expect their investments to be managed in a sustainable way. And so it's really important that we understand where we are. It's really important that we have transition plans, because if we simply use emissions data to make those sorts of judgments, we might miss all sorts of real opportunities. Let's take an example. If you look at some of the sectors that are really struggling, maybe the chemical industry sector, maybe some of the building sectors, the steel industry, they do not have the technology that they need at the moment to hit their net zero targets, but we need them to get it. They are a critical part of the transition. If you simply look at emissions data, and you start to move away from those companies because they've got high emissions and move into companies with lower emissions. If you get under the skin of it and you start to look at their transition plan, you might see that they're doing amazing things. So we invest in a German chemical company called Lind. It's one of the highest emitters in our portfolio. Most of that emission comes from hydrogen plants. So using our old methodology, we would tilt away from them and we would tilt towards another company. Look at their transition plan, get under the skin, and what do you see? You see that they are investing $1 billion in low carbon hydrogen, that they've got pilot plants up and running where they're actively looking at that. They might be today's problem, but they're actually part of tomorrow's solution. With a transition plan, we can see that and we can invest much more intelligently and therefore much more in the financial interests of our members.
It's a very holistic view. Alistair, as you are steeped in the workings of policy and government, as PBS, would you see a greater role within the Treasury, for example, in an incoming Labor government to build on the work of the TPT?
Oh, definitely, right. I think we recognise that much as we have very big ambitions, I think, and hopefully a vision that will be continued to be clarified between now and the election about exactly where we see the big comparative opportunities for growth in this country. The only way we're going to do that is in collaboration, and it's the way we run our financial services review, it's the way we've gone out and set up key commissions around some of the challenges in infrastructure that we know we're going to need to break through. But actually the TPT and I think bodies like that are another really good example of exactly that collaboration. So I think both in the specific work of the TPT and how we can partner with that and how we can make sure that we're rolling out that voluntary and mandatory requirements around disclosure guidance that's really going to push forward this agenda. But also the ethos of this approach, that close collaboration between business, policymakers, finance and other stakeholders in a trusting but mutually challenging environment is so important. And I think it will be a big part of our vision for how we'd like to partner with stakeholders right across the economy and government.
Well, it's good news for the TPT.
May I just add to Helen's comment actually about, there are industries that are, the pathways are kind of, it will take longer, etc. But all this is part of the sort of the just and fair transition as well, which is part of the TPT, etc. We have to think about those, there are smaller companies that do not have the bandwidth, understanding, is fragmented. We need to give them time to learn, understand how they can be a part of it, and we need to support them through that process. That's really important. That's smaller companies, that's the supply chain I talked about. There are regions that will be exposed more than others. There are a workforce that need to retrain and be reskilled to meet the needs of new technologies, etc. So all that has to be considered.
Time is against us all.
It certainly is, and that's why we have to lean into it rather than just sit. Otherwise the risk is that we are becoming passive if we are afraid of making calls and decisions. We have to believe in what we're doing.
Vanessa, can you see a point at which actually these timelines come in? 2050 is sort of, you'll evolve the guidance to say that's not good enough, it has to be sooner. I mean, change obviously doesn't occur in a linear way. It responds to events.
I mean, I think if you look at the data that we're getting at the moment from, I mean, you mentioned the ocean temperature, you can see that we could be working to an accelerated timeline, and we would have to scale what we're doing very quickly. So yes, it's definitely a possibility. It's all uncertain, and we're progressing as quickly as we can. So the big focus needs to be next. We've got this magnificent suite of documents. It's now all about implementation.
Right, and I think you've got a call for evidence till April 25, so it's very timely for anybody who wants to.
Oh yes, can I make a pitch? So, Transition Finance Market Review, which is looking at transition finance, grounded in transition plans, but more broadly, we have a call for evidence out. We would love you to reply. We know that a number of the financial institutions and financial trade associations are replying. Can I please put out a big sort of virtual cuddle to anybody in professional services and real economy? We would love to hear your thoughts on how to make the UK a leading market for transition finance, whether that's transition finance for the UK or transition finance globally. Please have a look.
Professional cuddle, I like that. Is that a legal term? Is that allowed?
It is now.
We have 5 minutes left to go, but so I want to see if there was anyone in the audience that wanted to ask questions. We'd like to make this interactive. Oh my goodness, okay. Let's start, hang on, I saw the first hand go up. The white shirt there and this gentleman here, just to start, and then I will come to you. Where's our microphone? So here, yeah, the chap in there. Oh, either one of you. You're too polite, really.
Hi there, James Davey, Ricardo. I'm sort of a climate scientist, probably a real climate scientist would turn in their model if I said that, but I'm pretty much a climate scientist, and I'm not hearing much about risk. Physical risk, and I don't think scope 3 is the elephant in the room. I think global mean surface temperatures are the elephant in the room. Is TPT going to drive real action in adaptation? Because if companies don't start to identify physical risks now and start to adapt now, we're going to see two things. We're going to see losses, big losses, and we're going to see a backlash against decarbonisation. Because if the society sees that billions of pounds are being thrown at decarbonisation and they're not being protected from the impacts of climate change, net zero is gone. So are we going to see adaptation?
Do you want to take that, Vanessa?
So it's a really good point. In the framework, in the technical guidance, there is specific reference to risk and resilience. I think we have to acknowledge that the level of thinking right across the economy is not as evolved on that as it needs to be, but the groundings are there, and I think we're going to need to work more on it over the coming years. So yeah.
Alistair, adaptation, what's the policy? It must be in the manifesto somewhere.
I think I would completely agree with that in terms of the ethos, right? I think there is definitely probably a slight difference in pace in terms of how we push forward thinking in terms of as a market, as sectors, as a wider economy, how we best need to coordinate the mitigation and adaptation that's going to have to go alongside pretty much any transition pathway at this point, given what we know at a bare minimum is likely to happen in terms of physical risk evolution. When I was at the Bank of England, it was one of the most interesting parts of my work actually was working with some of the largest insurers who were grappling with exactly these questions and how it might play out across their books. I think to offer some reassurance, while it probably isn't as front-footed as other aspects of our net zero policy at the moment, I think within both our work in Ed's team, but also within DEFRA and some wider environmental work too, actually the need to make sure that a lot of our mitigation and adaptation work goes alongside this and goes in hand with the pathways that we know we're steering towards is very much front and centre in our policy team's work.
I guess ultimately the government is the insurer of last resort, and that means us, because we're the taxpayers behind the government. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Aslan, technology scientist and an actor. Just come off the European Union Social and Economic Committee on the 6th of March, where it was our youth priorities to put forward CSDD back on the table. Before the 6th of March, it was, as you all know, it was a roadblock. So it's good to hear that our recommendation was picked up by the council on the 15th, and now on the 24th of April, it's on the final legal hurdle. So, so that's one. And obviously,
what was
I'm
your
going
question?
back on Thursday. So thank you for talking about the reporting side. So when I go back on Thursday, the reporting, we need to push it from January 2025. That's way too late. We need to push it to summer this year. And in terms of technologies, we've actually got quantum on the cloud. Before we needed to build billions.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, so the question is,
Sorry, it's just so I could see the time.
With quantum, we can actually create new catalysts that could recycle carbon dioxide into clean fuel, new compounds that could boost the power of batteries, and new proteins that could transform how we can treat diseases.
Green
from
tech.
years to minutes.
Green
and it's
tech.
about creating a space for the youth to test these in hackathons, and that is the solution to what you were saying, how we do this, how we implement more hackathons, putting youth 18 to 25 on the table.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have enough time for all the tech to catch up. Thank you. Helen, investment in nanotechnology, new battery solutions, is that something in your portfolio?
So it's something that we would consider, but with all of our investments, we look carefully at them. We're looking for things that manage risk and create opportunities. And with climate change, there are both real risks to our members, but there are real opportunities in terms of investing in green technology and in the future. And we are always looking for opportunities to do the best thing for our members. We are a very long-term investor. We don't have the short-term investment horizons that many others have, so we can think about.
So there is capital there for that kind of thing. I think we're probably only going to be able to have one more question. I see lots of hands. I'm sure the panelists would talk to you afterwards. Can I get this chap here in the jumper? Yes. With his hand remaining up. Staying powder. The staying powder works.
My name's Sagar. My interest is in supply chains. But supply chains much more on a global scale than most people would actually look at, which is, I would say, more cradle to cradle. So it was mentioned about scope 3. When I look at not how the product is perceived, i.e. wind turbine or solar panel in the West, I'm looking at not even the manufacturing point. I'm looking at, from a supply chain perspective, all the way back to where the resources originally come from. It's not anywhere near Europe. It's all the way 3,000 miles away somewhere in Africa, in China or Peru or Bolivia. Those countries have the largest populations in the world. They own the largest resources, but they don't have access to their own resources because they've all been hijacked by companies from the West. My question is, when there are so many human rights abuses in, for example, in Congo, where millions of people have been destitute, I'm just wondering, how is this transition plan going to work when a country like Niger removed France from their country and said, we are going to sell these resources on our terms, not on your terms anymore? Have we put ourselves at risk in the UK when a country of 1 billion people, Africa, continent, is now saying, not on these colonial terms anymore, but on our rules? Thank you.
So this is a subject that is age-old, really, I think, and probably even beyond transition plans, but obviously we discussed that all of these extra risks need to come into play. Jonas, I'm going to put you on the spot there in terms of taking into account all of these knock-on effects.
It is a fair challenge. Again, coming back to the just transition, a just transition not only on a regional basis or in the UK, it's on a global scale as well. All these have to be considered, but equally, we have to create opportunities everywhere. If this is the way to, create opportunities outside Europe, if that's what you're pointing at, this is a real opportunity to do that. It has to be considered that it's on, everyone benefits, there are local benefits. So if you do If we do export something out of the country, make sure that the benefits of that is benefiting the wider population and not the few. But as you point, Emily, this is age-old. This is not something new, but it's incredibly important that we are thoughtful about on the supply chains. I mean, you should probably ask the question to the next panel who's in the industry, how they are running that. Not want to put anyone on the spot, but that's probably how I should ask.
Well past hot potato. Thank you. We've gone over time, so thank you all. And thank you our panellists. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you. And thanks, Sam. I think we have our next round. Just as we're heating up the discussion here on all the very important things, I welcome them to the stage. So we have Alistair Phillips-Davies from SSE, the Chief Executive, the Utilities Company, Robin Mills, CEO of Compass Group, and John Stanton, the CEO of Weir Group. We certainly are very privileged to have you all turning up here at the Guildhall. Yes, please, thank you. Thank you very much. You're not even the caterer, you know.
Obviously, I'm making the most of this. Yeah, obviously trying. It's the only thing I'll be served in.
This is Alistair from SSE. Thank you all for being here. My colleague, Head of Operations at the FT, Abby Scott, who's sitting up the front here, I asked her what I should ask everybody, and she said, ask if it's real. And by that, I said, oh, Abby, climate change, of course it's real. And she said, no, the data, is the data real? And I'm sure that's a question that you're asking and answering quite often. Alistair, I'm going to start with you. So our subject here is why publish a transition plan. You're at the front lines as an energy company. You had to grapple with many corporate wins, government wins in the last few years, maintained your sense of humour. You've given yourself until 2040 to reduce scope 1 and 2 and net zero by 2050. And we were just hearing in the previous panel about 2050 maybe not good enough and too far out. How has having a transition plan been a help or a hindrance?
Well, I think a transition plan, you can have targets, but if you've got no real way of, or you've got no real statements about how you get there, particularly when you put these goals so far off. So even at the time, back in 2017, when we had legally binding targets for 2050, that was a long way away in certainly a political sense. And so for us, having a transition plan was important so that we all knew where we were going, how we might actually do things. It was particularly important for the tricky issues because this isn't a trivial thing to achieve. There's a lot of cost goes in there. There's a lot of things happen. Things go wrong on the way. You need to be able to measure when things have gone wrong, figure out how you're going to actually alter them, maybe do it in different ways. We can see that within our business now. Essentially, most, I'd say, large integrated energy companies, whereas 5 years ago they were 2/3 of their capex was going on renewables, 1/3 networks. That's all spun around because of returns in renewables. Renewables is less in fashion now, and people are doing more of the network side of that of that build out. So I actually think it's about making sure that there's a solid debate within the company. It also goes up and down the company. We had a special board meeting, a special session of the board before we published that transition plan back in 22 in order to do that. So it kind of got people on board, it got a lot of buy-in. And I think particularly, I'll go back to that tricky issues, which is one of the things our Chief Sustainability Officer, Rachel, who's out here, talks about. It makes sure that we get out there and have those debates on those difficult areas.
So you don't think that having a plan, when people think, oh God, we're departing from the plan, means they are scared to come to you because now you know what the plan is, you've signed off on it?
I think that's about, without getting too into sort of, do you have a culture in an area where you can have a safe space to have an honest conversation? I've got a couple of CEOs here who run very successful businesses. I'm sure if their business isn't doing too well in some part of the world, or they're not selling enough sandwiches, bottles of water or whatever, they want somebody to come and tell them why. at the end of the day, because that's the only way you're going to do anything about it. That's the only way you're going to solve those problems. So I think that's more of a cultural issue and about whether you've got people who are strong enough to stand up and say, look, this isn't going well, how are we going to get there? And without going through the details, we've certainly got a few bumps in the road. We've had a few bumps in the road. You know, when we buy another business, when we get another opportunity, you know, poor Rachel and the department get hauled in, and hopefully before we buy it, we normally tell them, and you know, and they've got to figure out how they're going to make this work. You know, we've got 80% reduction by 2030 in our carbon emissions, 2.72 million tonnes is that sort of number emblazoned there. Those are the sort of things that we worry about, but it does prompt that in the last year, 18 months, and we continue to have them. We have difficult conversations around our ExCo table about investments we want to make, how it impacts on those plans, and pretty much every time Rachel or her team get dragged into the room, and it's one of the big issues that we end up kicking around.
And is that feeding up into the financing, into your financiers, into that conversation?
Yeah, well, I think on the financing side, you know, our business, one of our big North Stars, is about the energy transition, is absolutely the heart of what we're doing. Because of the work that we're doing, the targets we set ourselves, the plans that we put out, and therefore all the work that, you know, particularly our sustainability department does on communicating what we do, we can issue green sort of bonds. I think we're the biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues in Europe of green bonds in recent years. We've got a revolving credit facility that's a green one, so we get a slight discount as long as we hit certain targets in terms of getting into the indices and ratios that people measure and things like that. So our business does transfer through into what the finance director, what the Treasury Department can actually do. You know, at the moment, renewables and utilities are a little out of favour, so you know, share price isn't riding quite as high, so the equity financing may not be quite as good. But actually, on the private market side, I would say, you know, lots of people want to partner with us and do things. There's a lot of people willing to put funds in with us, and you know, recently sold a part of our transmission business, which has got huge growth in it, and did that at an attractive price that helped us fund it going forward.
So ultimately having a plan is more of a help than a hindrance, although obviously quite a lot of work. Robin, at Compass, you've got a 2050 net zero plan, and it's a business that serves a lot of public sectors as well, schools and hospitals and prisons. Do you feel there's a tension there between the net zero targets and the customer base, which is by necessity needing to have competitive contracts?
I mean, not really. I mean, just sort of go back half a step. So in the UK and Ireland, we've set a much more ambitious target than the wider group for 2030. And I mean, the way I sort of felt, you know, this is about, you know, how you galvanize organizations and how you use the TPT. I felt as though our approach to sustainability and environment was basically a long shopping list of sort of individual actions 5 years ago. There was lots of good work going on. We had some visionaries in the organization. We had some visionary clients, and we had some visionary suppliers. But it needed bringing it together. So the net zero commitment at that stage, sort of a couple of years ago, really helped us, well, produce a more meaningful mission that actually got, you know, the 50,000 people in the organization behind it, the chef body, the supply group, that it gave them something much more purposeful. And even though that shopping list we tried in, you know, pyramids and temples and all the other things to try and make it look more coherent, actually it was only when we really made the net zero commitment that it actually became more coherent. And so we've had a couple of years of really positive decarbonisation work with suppliers around menus, around seasonal cooking, around less distributor miles, all that good stuff. That actually in our business is commercially sensible as well as environmentally sensible, and so we feel as though we're sort of going with the swim in our model. But at some point you need to get into the detail and you need to start spreading the accountability around, and that's what the TPT did for us. I mean, we just finished it at the end of February. We launched it with a conference because, you know, we are a business with big supplier groups and big client groups and lots of employees. So whenever you do anything, you have to get a lot of people together to engage them. And it really felt as though we then got much better ownership within the divisions, and again then with suppliers. And so actually, although the tone sometimes is about, you know, rules and constrictions and so on, found it very helpful because it took us to a level of planning that we probably wouldn't have got to by ourselves. And actually, around this topic, I speak as something of a sort of punter but an enthusiastic one. You can sometimes feel a bit of a victim of all the rules and frameworks and so on, and sometimes you feel like you're not entirely in control. But I always felt with the TPT process we were in control, and we ended up with something which is very practical and helps us. And actually, some of it is part of stuff we were doing anyway, and some of it is stuff that we weren't doing and needed to do.
And to answer Abby's question, are you now at the level of being able to come up with detail, verify the detail that goes in as a next sort of step in the process?
Yeah, I mean, we're a business of detail. We're a business of thousands of clients and hundreds of suppliers and 5,000 sites. And in order to make the business work, you have to get into the detail. You have to look at menus. You have to look at individual suppliers. You have to help them with whatever their processes are. You have to get into the detail. But I think it's more about the accountability as well as the detail. It is about breaking it down to small enough pieces for people to do their bit, and then they can see how it hangs in a much more important frame.
So if you break it down enough, you can then do proper verification. Because it's one thing to have the detail and another thing to verify that it's accurate, that the sandwich you're eating is 600 calories versus 300.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a world where we're quite used to verification for, as you say, labeling, and not just for carbon, but for many other things as well, allergens and everything else. So we're quite a sort of compliant, sort of well-structured, rules-based sort of process, because when you're dealing with food, you've got to be, and then in different divisions you have different sets of rules around education or hospital feeding or whatever. So it's quite a good organisation to do that in, but you're right, all the proof then is there.
And John, Weir Group, what's your approach, given 98%, I think, of your emissions are from miners using your machinery? Tell us a little bit about your business and what the challenges are.
Yeah, so in case the audience hasn't heard of the Weir Group, we're a UK industrial company, an engineer who provides mission-critical equipment to the mining industry globally. So we operate on thousands of mines around the world, providing the equipment and spare parts to keep those mines running and producing the metals and minerals that are going to be critical for day to day, but to the future transition. And we're sort of 200 kilometers from every major mine on the planet, so we have a pretty unique view of what is going on there. And where we've come from strategically is that we've had a transition plan now for a couple of years, actually initially based on TCFD, but now incorporating the principles we've been talking about today. And the beauty for us is that it is completely entwined with our purpose as a company, our strategy as a company, because our purpose essentially is to help the miners produce all of the metals that are going to be required to achieve net zero and through decarbonisation and electrification. So that's a growth driver for us, as well as important from a sustainability point of view. But the double sort of benefit from a commercial point of view is that our customers, the miners, in terms of the new capacity we need, it needs to be done in a completely different way. The miners can't mine and process and engage with communities on the social side in the way they had done before. They have to do it differently. And that's where technology and engineering is going to be the solution, both from a hardware point of view, but increasingly using software code and AI as well to enable the industry to do things in a smarter, more efficient manner. So we're in this really nice sweet spot as a company where our corporate commercial strategy is absolutely aligned with our sustainability strategy. They're entwined like the double helix of DNA. And so a transition plan was something that was very, very natural for us to do as we evolved that
Give us an
strategy.
example, perhaps, of where it applies to a project where it's been beneficial, and because there's still quite a lot of emissions, right, involved in.
Yeah, so let me talk about scope 3. So we operate 11 foundries around the world, so we have quite a significant CO2 footprint of our own. but 98% of our emissions come from scope 3, because every year, every piece of equipment that we sell is measured, and don't get me going on all of the duplication and everything else, but the lifetime energy consumption of that piece of equipment, and these things will last for 10, 20, 30 years, is measured as our scope 3 in any one year, the year we sell it. So we have this huge scope 3 footprint. And how do you attack that footprint? Well, from an engineering point of view, we have to make the equipment much more efficient and use less energy, also less water as well, which is obviously another issue. And we have to drive that from a technology point of view. And at the same time, our customers have to come at it from they're going to green up their grid and increasingly use renewable power to run the equipment in wherever the mine is. And that's easy in some parts of the world if you're in a place where there's lots of wind and solar and everything else. But that's not the case in many parts of the world. But that's the conundrum. And that's why, for us, we've got to tackle that scope 3 number, but we can only do what's in our control. So what we're doing is all of our R&D spend, all of our technology thinking is about how can we make this equipment more efficient and more sustainable. So all of our R&D is now really directed in that direction. And we've basically coming up with a new mousetrap for how miners can process these materials so they can be delivered. And we actually did a case study at COP28, which was the first use case in mining for avoided emissions, or scope 4 essentially. Yeah. So, we've got this scope 3 footprint, it's not going to go away, but what are we doing to avoid it being bigger? And we presented a case study with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development Sponsorship. And that case study for a redefined sort of processing plant on a mine comes up with 40% less energy consumption, 50% less CO2 emissions, and actually 20% cost savings overall as well, which is really, really big numbers and very, very powerful. So that's what we're trying to drive towards, sort of replacing the traditional ways of doing things, which have a much bigger scope 3, to more sustainable and efficient ways, which is now sort of, we've published the data, it's been third-party assured, and we're now pushing that very hard within the industry and more broadly with all of the other stakeholders.
Is there third-party assurance industry growing, and is it reliable enough for your sustainability committee?
Well, I think on the previous panel, somebody said, we're all trying to do the best thing here, right? So the data is going to be imperfect, but over time, the more we understand this, the more you systemize, automate, get assurance, the better it's going to be. Okay. And we've learned over the sort of 5-6 years that we've been doing this a huge amount. But it's still, is it perfect? No. But is it getting better? Is the assurance industry there and supportive? Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you. Scope 4 has avoided emissions, as I can see. We can spend the next decade talking about that. Alistair, getting to the board and support of the board and sustainability committees. In fact, because it's been the 2-year mark since Glasgow, where lots of companies signed up for the race to net zero, and then it came to a point you had to sign off on not you, but companies had to sign off on their transition plans after 2 years. And the Science-Based Targets Initiative has not crossed out, but removed a lot of companies from their consideration just because these plans haven't really been able to shape up. And it seems to me some of that is coming down through the Sustainability Committee process. And we talked a lot about process here, but those committees didn't exist 3 years ago, and they do now. How does that play into your planning and having a plan? Making it tougher to have a plan, but also wanting to do as we've heard, the best we can.
Sure. So I think for us, as I said, is that the energy transition is the heart of our strategy. Basically, it's what we're there for, whether it's networks, renewables, and or low carbon flexibility. We're in all of those 3 businesses. They're all huge consumers of capital potentially, and we've got a lot of plans to do that. The board approves the overall strategy of the investment, so pretty much every board meeting we're approving things or dealing with things that are focused very much on that. So I would say it goes up and down the organisation, basically. So at every level, we've got an organisation that's focused on what we're able to deliver. Obviously, ultimately, it's going to, you require those different individual businesses, rather than maybe producing pumps and doing them more efficiently, or harvesting food locally so you can give sandwiches to people. We're sitting there making those detailed decisions about how we generate energy or invest it more efficiently and more effectively. That all comes up. Ultimately, I'm going to be responsible as the chief exec and my exec committee, and then that all goes to the board as well, the high level, and that sort of accountability at the highest level is absolutely there at the board. And as I said earlier, for some of those difficult decisions, we've seen one of our jurisdictions over in Ireland, they need more emergency generation. We had a lot of debates around how we were going to give that emergency generation, given that they were essentially looking for some of the most polluting stuff that you've got in Europe to be built. It framed decisions that we took, how we responded to governments in terms of saying that we were only prepared to operate a plant for a certain amount of time. They would have to have a plan to convert them or to do something very different with them, and we could maybe help them with that. So I think for us as a business, it's not just a sustainability committee, it's not just a chief sustainability officer and all of her staff. We're fortunate because we're needed. The electricity sector needs to transition to net zero first to enable a lot of the other industries to get there as well. That it's just been at the heart of what we've done, and so it's been a little bit easier to see that and to have it up and down the organisation.
And that Irish example, what caused that? What caused that need for sort of to burn?
Well, not to be too critical of Ireland, but they got off to a good start with renewables. Then they didn't do any offshore wind, although they talked about it for a long time. And they built, and they forgot to build the offshore wind or do anything else. And they built lots and lots of data server farms on the back of AI, because they're a very big base for a lot of the big tech companies in Europe. And then suddenly started running out of power. So they, their grid suddenly went, we've got a big problem here. We're not, we're literally going to have diesel generators running car parks all over Dublin unless we're careful. So they came to a few of us, and we came up with the best solution we could. But it's not a great solution. They've subsequently, run some offshore wind auctions, and they're moving on that. But there's more work to be done for a country that started really well. It's kind of fallen behind a bit on that renewable stake, and it's been one of the countries in Europe with the most rapid growth in terms of electricity consumption. A lot of Europe's reduced gas and electricity demand, particularly following the Russian-Ukraine crisis, whereas the Irish economies continue to be that Celtic tiger, and particularly on the energy side because of those data farms.
So it's a very good example of where transition plans can get sort of thrown off track by the day-to-day realities. Robin, have you found that? Have you found a situation where your plan has been thrown off track by some sort of unforeseen event that you then have to catch up with and explain to the board and the sustainability committee what happened?
Not really.
Not that you're going to tell us.
Quite a build-up to the question. But, no, I don't think so, because I guess, well, one, we've only just completed the transition plan, so it's only the end of February, really, that it was sort of all firmed up and launched. But secondly, because I guess we're a more sort of incremental, smaller moving parts than the example that Alistair gave. And it's more a case of where you can maybe push a bit faster than you might have planned to, or where it's a timing issue, I think, more than anything else, really. That's what I feel.
You don't have other factors such as nature-based issues or supply chain issues which have thrown
Yeah, I mean, the supply chain issues with the conflicts around the world, the climate with the capital C issues on crops and things like that. But the business is flexible enough and resilient enough to be able to cope with those in the short term. And then to a question that was asked earlier on, to build longer term resilience by, we banned air freight, we import much less, we cook more seasonally, more locally, and so on. So all that creates a resilience as well in general. For us, I think, if you think about what we're doing, we're basically cooking for clients on their sites, in their locations. And so there are some clients who will give us a tow in terms of their ambition around net zero and around other environmental matters. And then there are others where we're having to give them a push. And then, but what I think we do find is that it does give us enormous leverage with our own supplier base. I was with a big supplier this morning, and as part of my preparation for tonight, I asked them about some of these points, and they said, oh, look, the fact that you've made such an ambitious net zero commitment makes it a whole lot easier with our suppliers, because we can bring the volumes. If they get it right, we can give an awful lot of volume in that supply chain. So we can create a lot of leverage for good, and then we pass that on to our clients. So it's not quite the same, you know, sort of binary issues that Alistair was talking about, but we definitely have to move more flexibly in order to continue to make progress.
Have you done some predictive work on crops, for example, and the effect of climate change on crops as part of your planning, your adaptation, and so on?
I don't think at that level we've gone to that kind of detail, but we've certainly looked at different sourcing approaches and the risks and benefits with some of those, and of course, you know, making sure that the chefs are. I mean, this is the point I was going to make about sort of making sure it's in the muscle. So for us, our apprenticeship modules have sustainability and nutrition actually modules within them, so that and all the chef competitions have criteria against their provenance of the supply chain and where they brought their ingredients from and so on, and then there are conditions about making sure that at least 2 of the courses are planned forward and how they deal with dairy and so on, and that just puts it into the muscle of the business, so that the chef population and the menu provisions are much more connected to what's going on in the rest of the world and in the rest of the supply chain. So it's just less stiff than it used to be. And in general, the direction of travel is to a more resilient supply chain as well.
So as before I turn to audience for questions, can I ask each of you to, you know, for the benefit of those who aren't in a CEO position, the one thing that you think will be a game changer in the next 5 years? I know I didn't prep you for this question, so John.
A game changer in the next 5 years. Well, I think, you know, I would say that the thing that needs to be the game changer is that there isn't enough metal at the moment. And if you look at it, you know, by any sort of forecast, the production of copper probably needs to double over the next 10 or 20 years to enable us to get to net zero by 2050, and nobody knows where it's coming from. And that's, you know, that is an elephant in the net zero room to my mind. So particularly in the West, we need to figure out how we get the copper, the nickel, the lithium, the other metals that we are going to need to decarbonize and electrify, and I think we need a plan for that in the next few years. So I think that is absolutely critical, and it needs a system-wide approach. It needs an energy solution, it needs you know, government solution, it needs international collaboration, you know, where we're able to do that. It needs the providers of capital to finance these projects, because, you know, certainly the UK listed miners are not planning to spend the money that we actually need to spend to get the metal, so it's all a bit disconnected at the moment. So I think the need for the next 3 to 5 years is to come up with a plan and then get on with it, otherwise we don't get to net zero.
Okay, so policy, need big policy joined up. I was listening to the FT Commodities Conference in Lausanne, which is mainly all of the fossil fuel people, and the same call came from there about unified policy. So, but you know, this information sharing is unprecedented and should help with all of that. Alistair, do you find that there are policy shifts somewhere in the world that you can hold on to as an example of what might come down that track? And also the same question to you about what would make the biggest difference, technological or policy, in the next 5 years?
I think, unfortunately, you need everything. You need everything everywhere all the time and as quickly as possible. So I think policy has probably gone slower. If you look in the US, they've got huge reserves of fossil fuels, so they're less bothered. You can see number of companies in the renewable sector who went with high-level government policy but didn't have the follow-up on, really trying to accelerate consenting issues, keeping up with the issues in supply chain in terms of costs. A number of companies are taking big hits. If you look at a lot of the renewables companies have either lost a ton last year or are probably off 25% so far this year in terms of the share price and value. So I think that follow-through on policy is one really, really important thing, and actually consenting to a lot of it. I think on the technological side, Mr. Musk, who lots of people seem to follow, was talking about AI. They'll be cleverer than any human being by the end of the year or the end of next year. So I do think technology is important in that sense, and I'm sure AI will play a very big part of that. And the other thing that we're all leaning into at the moment is networks, where we're going to get our power from and how we're going to be able to store it and move it, because storing electricity is quite tricky generally. It's not an easily stored matter, but the area that we're making a difference on at the moment is building networks that will hopefully be fit for the future. Mm-hmm. And then the other assets have to follow when maybe that policy and maybe some of those other investment supply chain issues sort themselves out, because that's certainly been an issue recently.
So grid technology is the thing. Everywhere in the world it seems to be.
Well, grid deployment is a big issue. Most businesses that you talk to, if they want to build an asset, it's quite difficult to get connections to the grid. And I think people mentioned earlier there was a discussion about grid reforms and things like that from the other Alistair, Labour MP, talking about those things, and that is important. So building the networks that are right for the future is important. Basically, how do we connect up the generation sources, and how do we connect up the people that need that generation?
Right, yeah, I think that's something we'll be hearing. Grid networks doesn't sound sexy, but the next year I think it's going to be all about that. Robin, what's the one thing in the next 5 years that will make it be a game changer? Policy or technology or whatever you like?
I think it's a change in the attitudes of food waste. We can make enormous progress environmentally, sustainability-wise, if people's attitudes of food waste change to almost like it was like drink driving or something. Mm-hmm. It's an absolute crime. It's a relatively easy thing to get control of. Portion size and so on. It's an area where depending on the research, 20%, 30%. You can imagine 20% of anything or 30% of anything to not make use of it or throw it away is absolute crime. You think about how difficult it is to get food to people. So quite how we bring it around, but a combination of policy and sort of a cultural change, I think, it will be a massive step change.
Well, the pandemic and other things have shown, war has shown that we can make big changes as a society very quickly if we have to, and whether it's not wasting energy or not wasting food. And not to waste time, we have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. The microphone, please. Yeah. Yes, this lady here with the scarf. Thank you.
Hello, Carlota Garcia from Royal London Asset Management. We were delighted to see the TPT including social and just transition considerations. My question is for Alistair. SSE was one of the pioneer companies publishing a just transition plan alongside a climate transition plan. Can you share some reinforcing parts of the experience that can maybe influence others or inspire others on kind of following this example? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So we've also always felt that we needed to have a fair transition as part of what we were doing, and we often refer to this as the Just Transition Plan. So making sure, I can give examples, the second, or the first large wind farm we built in Scotland at Beatrice, we took on about 70% of the people who work in Wick, which is a place way up in the north of Scotland for those who don't know it. About 70% of the people working there when we rebuilt our control centre there and rebuilt quite a few bits of the harbour and other stuff. We retrained people from the oil and gas industry to come and work in that. And look, at the end of the day, if we're spending billions and billions of pounds, and just SSE as a company's got a £20 billion 5-year programme on at the moment, and it'll probably be 40 to 50 billion over a 10-year period. if we're going to be spending that much money, we've got to bring communities with us, and therefore it's essential that we can offer jobs, that we can offer facilities and things like that. If we're taking everything from overseas, if we're offering nothing to certain communities, let's say around Aberdeen, but all those jobs are migrating somewhere else, and we're just taking new people on, I don't think we're doing the right things. So we get a lot of plaudits for that. So for those people who just want to do it on an economic basis, you tend to find politicians, if you're interested in them, quite like you. People write nice stories about you, which doesn't always happen in the energy sector. So even the FT write nice stories about us sometimes on these things.
No fear or favour. That's
no, indeed. So ultimately, you can feel good about yourself. You'll find it really improves your employee brand in terms of taking people on. So if I go back to when we disposed of our retail domestic business, we were about 10,000 people. We're well over 14,000 now. We've been growing at well over 1,000 people a year. It has been trickier during the pandemic, but actually taking on lots of new people in an industry where you're actually having to generate new people because it's very new, and dealing with HVDC, let's have another acronym, why don't we, which is high voltage DC currents, because there's a lot of that stuff going on in the UK. We've managed to attract a lot of talent into the business because of the things that we've done, the things that we stand for. So, whether it's pure economic sense, whether you want to feel good about yourself, whether you want to make it easier to attract people, there are all sorts of good reasons for having a just transition plan. But the ultimate one will be, if we don't sort out or help society on our journey here, society will reject the spend that we're making and will reject us as a business.
Good point. So many hands. As the microphone's closest to you, just here in the pink, FT pink shirt.
Thanks. Chris Doddwell from Impacts Asset Management. So we've just covered just transition. I wanted to flip over to nature. All three of your organisations and your supply chains are having impacts on nature, and one of the things we struggled with in putting together the TPT guidance was how do you capture this, how do you try to integrate that, and my feeling is that actually it's the real economy actors that are active in the world that have got more experience there actually than governments at the moment. So I just wonder if maybe you can share thoughts from your supply chain around what lessons corporate activity can have for policymakers.
Let's start with Robin on nature, and then John.
Yeah, I mean, the TPT framework does enable you it keeps it nice and broad in terms of nature and water and so on. So it does enable, it frames the conversation for you to have with your suppliers right down at the farm level and right down at where they get their feed from, and absolutely every level of detail. And I'm not sure, those conversations used to take place, but it's much better framed up through TPT. So absolutely, I think that's brought it much further through the front of mind. And back to your point of proof, you have to say what progress you're going to make in those topics and how you're going to measure it. And so that's where the accountability comes in. So absolutely.
John.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much real experience as far as, it's the next thing on our journey. We've focused on, as I think most companies have done, doing things kind of in sequence. What are the big hitters? What is the most important thing for us to do? Let's deal with that, then move on to the next one. And in the next year, then water and nature become, the next priority.
I was going to say, won't that come into scope 3 in many ways because of the impact on nature of the mining activities?
Correct.
Right, okay. Fairly to move onto that pretty quickly, I think. Their beard white shirt, sorry.
Thanks, James Hapkins at Masons. With companies increasingly getting taken to court over climate issues, to what extent are you using your transition plan as a bit of a defensive strategy to climate mitigation?
Good question. Who hands up? Who wants to take that? Go on, Alistair, go on.
Well, I think a transition plan evolves. It goes back to that tricky issues I mentioned. We produced ours before this guidance came out. We supported the development of it and absolutely behind it. It's helped add to what we've done. So we've changed some things, particularly some of those nature things and some of those climate adaptation bits and pieces. I think that the fact that the plan is out there and that there is guidance on how to do it. One of the things that we talk about is integrity. So some people call it accountability, I think, in the standards. We refer to it as integrity. If you're actually doing the things that you're writing down, you really, really believe in them. I think as guidance moves forward, as you see best practice from other companies, I think that will drive us to do the right things. We've got nature issues with sort of marine life offshore, all of our transmission projects, which is kind of £20 billion of investment over the next 8 to 10 years, something like that. We want to see biodiversity net gain. That's pretty difficult to measure. And so actually when you get some of this guidance, it actually helps our teams measure, well, how are we getting net gain in biodiversity in terms of improving environments, particularly happens with peatlands in Scotland and stuff like that. So those are things that I'd refer to.
Okay, great, thank you. Next, orange shirt lady, yes, just there.
Thank you. Shayna Gallagher with the British Standards Institution. We've heard a lot about the need for policy intervention tonight, and there was a comment early on about the conceptual leap that the TPT framework made in moving beyond an organization's own need to decarbonize and facilitating that societal transition. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more from all of you about the degree to which your sustainability net zero efforts are aligning with your public affairs, external lobbying efforts, and speaking of leverage that you have with your supply chains, if doing more of that positive climate lobbying is something that you are empowering or instructing your supply chain to do as well.
I guess this is a slightly fraught topic though, isn't it? Because you can be accused of greenwashing if you're pushing your green message too far. Robin?
Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of maybe begin where you finished. And maybe just picking up the white shirt guy as well from earlier on. I mean, I see it in a much more positive way than maybe some of the tone of some of the questioning and so on. In terms of course, it represents proof, and one of the previous panelists said about you can, in terms of our investments, we can look at the transition plans of companies that we want to invest in, and I think that's a fabulous thing. And I'd love our clients or suppliers or partners to look at our transition plan and really get their head around, what we're up to and so on. I think that's quite an exciting thing. I feel really good about that. And I also feel as though the conversations that we're having with our suppliers, it has to be a guide and help, because not everybody is as well educated as this room is on these matters, and there's still nervousness about even taking the first step, let alone the 101st step. So I feel our responsibility is to guide and help. Sometimes bring a little bit of extra resource in terms of money or people, but really to get people into the game. And we've run 4 or 5 workshops with much smaller suppliers, because in our industry there's lots of small suppliers who would really struggle to get into this kind of topic in any impactful way. But we help. We run the workshops. We facilitate them amongst each others. We've got sort of 25 in the first 3 months that we've now got onto science-based targets, and they didn't know what that was until we started the conversation with them. So I think you've really got to take an advocacy type approach in order to get the whole system moving with you. And so, yeah, I see it in a very positive way.
Yeah, from my point of view, I mean, we're not a big company. We don't really do corporate affairs. We just do the right thing, to what Alistair said earlier. And,
That's
and
a great slogan.
But that means doing the right thing by all of the communities and the environments we're in. And some of those environments are very, very challenging, where there's really poor education, the local children don't get fed, there are environmental issues. So, and because we're sort of fragmented, wherever we are, there's a sort of slightly different issue. And we try and tackle it as best we can with the limited resources that we have. So, and I think,
Alistair, how do you balance this sort of, need for PR, for want of a better description of what you're doing, versus reality and...
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things is employ the right people. So, make sure in your sustainability department you've got plenty of people who like to hug a tree, and make sure that they're brave and they feel like they want to call you out. I think you need to be authentic. I think there was a big talk about transparency earlier as well, so therefore being really transparent, so that accountability and integrity is absolutely clear for all. And we have a big culture on safety. Essentially, one of the golden rules that we have of safety is to accept a challenge, basically. So if you're challenged to stop or you're not wearing your PPE or whatever, and I think it has to be the same on areas like this. You want to encourage people to challenge you and accept that challenge.
Okay, thank you. We've run over time. I would like to take many more of those questions because I can see lots of enthusiastic hands up, but I also see we are over, yes. We're several minutes over, but thank you all. Thank you to my panelists. It's been very good of you to take all of the questions and mine as well. Thank you for turning up. Please mingle, ask panelists and others in the room questions. The only way that we're going to make any progress is through sharing of information and questioning and answers. So thank you. Please. You guys. My apologies. Sorry, everybody. I left out the most important part, which are the closing remarks from Kate. Please. Kate Levick, please. Sorry, take your seats. Or have it, you know.
Yeah, no need to take seats, but I do feel obliged to thank a few people. So if you could just pause the conversations for 1 second while I do that. So first of all, I'd like to thank Amelia very much and our fantastic speakers across both panels. And I think this is one of the most important reasons I did want to stop before we proceed to drinks. I know I'm now very much in the way of drinks, so I'll try and, keep it speedy. But I would like to pay tribute to the enormous contribution of so many of you here today. I can see so many familiar faces in this room. This huge community has helped to make the materials that we've published today credible, robust, practical, and adaptable to the needs of many organisations and sectors. Obviously, I'd like to really thank our steering group, especially the steering group co-chairs, Aviva and Her Majesty's Treasury, our delivery group, and the 11 working groups across sectors and topics. Now I have got you pinned back in your seats. I've got to warn you that there is some clapping that I'm now going to expect you to do. I'd like to specifically thank the chairs and drafters of those 11 working groups. So, at a reasonably efficient clip, I'd like to thank James Close from NatWest, who chaired the Banks Group, with support from PwC, led by David Croker. I'd like to thank Chandra Gopinathan of Railpen, who chaired the Asset Owners Group, with support from Baringa, led by Emily Faramond. Chris Dodwell from Impacts and Pippa Morgan of Aviva, who chaired the Asset Management Group, with support from James Hulse. Steve Thompson from National Grid and Sora Utzinger from Aviva Investors, who chaired the Electric Utilities Group, with support from Kronos Sustainability, led by Rory Sullivan. Laura Hillis from the Church of England Pensions Board, who chaired the Metals and Mining Group, with support from Setaria, led by Sarah Gordon. So Paul Marsh from WWF and Irene Verdier from Tesco, who chaired the Food and Beverage Group, with support from BCG, led by Eden Cotty-Jones. Vanessa Harvard-Williams, who you met on panel 1, and Bruce Duguid from Federated Hermes, who chaired the Oil and Gas Group. Okay, we're getting there, I promise you. Faith Ward from the Prunell Pension Partnership and IIGCC, and Katie Spooner of the Environment Agency for chairing the Adaptation Group, with drafting led by Kit England of Paul Watkiss Associates. Nick Robin and Brendan Curran from the LSE, and Bella Landymore of the Impact Investing Institute for chairing the Just Transition Group, with drafting led by Jodianne Wang, also of the LSE. Ed Steeds of WWF for chairing the Nature Group, with support from BCG. and Heather Buchanan and Elliot Syriacs from Bankers for Net Zero for leading the SME group. So if you've been keeping score, you'll see that I got to 11 there. I must say I would also like to, of course, thank the City of London Corporation for enabling us to use this amazing venue tonight. And I'd like to thank the Transition Plan Taskforce Secretariat team, starting with my co-head Ben Caldecott. It's been a 2-year partnership now, one based on trust, on generosity. It's been one that's worked very well, I hope you'll agree. And the whole team is here tonight. There have been others who've been part of that team in the last 2 years, including some people seconded from other organisations who were very kind to enable that, and I'd like to thank all of those who've been part of the Secretariat team. Yes, go Secretariat. So while we have now published our final technical documents, the TPT's work isn't quite over, as Vanessa alluded to. We're continuing to support the Transition Finance Market Review, and we're still carrying out substantial international engagement with other jurisdictions and with multilateral forums that are considering transition plans. So the TPT was set up to create the resources required to say what a gold standard transition plan looked like and to support the momentum around transition plans. We have, to a very large extent, fulfilled that original mission. So I also need to turn it around to you, the audience, just to finish up here. If you do one thing following this event, please start a conversation on transition plans in your own organisation. If this is something you can do, recommend that your board discusses preparing a transition plan. And please, when you're having conversations tonight, look around you for those who are already on the journey for inspiration. And with that, I will let you carry on and proceed to drinks. But thank you so much, and good night.